My research sought to investigate the use and effect of potential buzzwords in the Northern Ireland museum sector. This research understood buzzwords defined in two ways. One is a term which describes a new process but with ambiguous terminology, and a term that is not usually used or lacking a common definition in the field. Investigating the use of buzzwords in policy is important because it affects how policy is interpreted and acted upon by museum management, which in turn affects their relationship with the public and impact on society. The meaning of terms are created through power relations in the museum sector, and these meanings can shift between institutions, and despite being vague, can often be granted a common sense meaning by power structures in both policy and institutions. The cultural policies introduced by New Labour in the 2000s placed greater emphasis on how museums solved issues and drivers to improve social inclusion and cohesion well-being, which inevitably informed museum practice, both adopted and resisted by museum professionals. Northern Ireland museum policy followed the shift, which was of significance given its position as a post-conflict society. However, the impact of language and policy has not been as studied here as extensively compared to the rest of the UK, and here the intersection between language and policy is much more pronounced. Museums are positioned to solve issues of reconciliation, so terms such as community inclusion have risen in use, yet despite being used, they are often vague and shift meaning. So I used a qualitative multi-method approach, which included interviews with museum professionals and policy and strategy analysis. The analytical approach combined a critical discourse analysis and Kyle Backey's What's the Problem approach. The research found that community inclusion and policy are dynamic and flexible in meaning. However, these meanings were influenced by discourses of power, instrumentalism, reconciliation, and well-being, which was reflected in interview. However, aspects of power made potential buzzwords of community and inclusion contestable, as each term varied in meaning according to museum department or type. This variation was subordinate to policy, and policy interpretations defaulted to two main groups, simplistically Protestant and Catholic. Those who did not fit into these categorizations or with the values of the museum were excluded in the name of inclusion. Museum professionals, however, often shared a desire to move away from this binary grouping. Nevertheless, these interpretations were controlled by underlying power relations within the museum sector, and despite resistance, museums were expected to adopt these terms to communicate their usefulness and value to stakeholders. Museums and museum management therefore deployed this language to further their own goals. In conclusion, this research found the terms community and inclusion to be ambiguous in meaning and deployment, and despite being buzzwords in some instances, their use was important for communication with stakeholders. However, these terms also carried common sense meanings, which are determined by policy, reinforcing how communities were categorized as needing intervention through a justification of reconciliation and well-being, in turn reduced the agency of communities to decide if they need such intervention, which increased the exclusion of groups despite seeking to support museums as a net positive force for inclusion. Thank you for listening to my presentation.